So, welcome back to the World Autism Summit, and we have Ira Heilveil, PhD, BCBA, and is a licensed clinical psychologist and behavioral analyst. He began his career as a clinical child psychologist and family therapist in the private nonprofit sector, consulting to public schools and to special education settings. In 1988, he began his own agency, which he grew from its inception to one of the largest providers of applied behavioral analysis, ABA services, for children with autism in the U.S. During his tenure as that company's CEO, he also began a school for children with autism in Armenia as a charitable NGO, which he still operates and is thriving today. He is currently the co-founder of Hyperion Behavioral Health Center. Dr. Heilveil maintains his connection to academia through teaching at UCLA Medical School, where he is the assistant clinical professor of psychiatry. He is the author of 2 books, scholarly articles, and presentations, writes a blog on a variety of his interests, holds a private pilot license, and produced the Emmy-nominated and critically acclaimed and multiple award-winning documentary, Autism in Love. Welcome, Ira.
Thank you. Thank you, Karen. I really appreciate that.
And I really want to welcome you to the World Autism Summit and ask you the most important question is, what inspired you to be part of the World Autism Summit?
Oh, any way that look, I'm getting old. So any way I can contribute to, hopefully after all these years, I've got something to say or something to contribute. And that's pretty much the motive. I have been in the field for a long time and seen a lot. Anyone who's been in it as long as I have, we've seen a lot. And hopefully we gain a perspective from the work that we do that, motivates us to share those thoughts with others. So hopefully you'll find it valuable. We'll see.
I'm sure we will. And as you know, we are really wanting to move the needle of understanding around autism and neurodiversity fastest way possible. Like get rid of the old thinking, break down barriers, and hopefully change the way people think that hasn't worked, and improve open up new ways of thinking and set things straight.
Yeah, or reopen old ways of thinking that people haven't paid much attention to, right?
Yeah.
Same. Yeah. I appreciate that. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you.
How do you hope that you can make the biggest impact in the world around autism?
Oh boy, the biggest impact in the world.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I don't know. I grew up in the 60s. Well, that's assuming I grew up. I never grew up, but I grew up in the 60s.
Did we ever?
Right. Yeah. Peter Pan. So, I had this social justice kind of thing happening in the back of my mind, always wanting to sort of make a difference. In fact, when I had my company which is now called Autism Learning Partners, you always decide on a little logo, not a logo, but like a tagline, so to speak. And the tagline that I chose was making a world of difference. And it's interesting you should mention that at this point, because the whole idea was how do we make the world a better place, And I kind of think that there's only certain people who can do that. There are maybe lawyers and politicians. I ended up becoming a psychologist with the goal of changing the world. And, at some point I realized there's very little one can do, right? But for me, I realized that it had to be one person at a time. Mm-hmm. And so I spent this life trying to help one person at a time. Mm-hmm. And now it's if you're lucky enough to have a long career, it ends up being hundreds, if not thousands of people that you end up helping. And so that's been good. In terms of the world stuff, I don't know that we want to go too far into that, but you know, I did start this school in Armenia partly out of the fact that when I went there at one point, I realized there was nothing, and really nothing to speak of by way of treating kids with on the autism spectrum. Kids had been essentially sent to orphanages, primarily sent to orphanages if they had symptoms of autism, where they were just warehoused, or they were sent to some distant relative to live sort of invisibly in the countryside. And so that really struck me as, something I could make a difference doing. And so that's sort of the beginning of that. And that, as you mentioned in the introduction, that became a big part of my life. But also, I've been consulting in Vietnam for a while and trying to offer my services around the world. For a while, I had a center in Mexico as well. Just trying to bring knowledge of what we do and how we can help people, as far as I can.
So you really are one of those people that has a really open heart that wants to reach out and help people globally.
I hope so.
Well, we all try our hardest,
The open hearts are more easily broken. So, as we get older, I'm not so sure how open.
Well, we're all getting older, but we just do the best that we can do for whatever we can.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
What is your biggest why for what you do?
The biggest why. It's interesting. When I teach, I usually say, don't ever ask why questions. I say, but I always say, if you hear a why question, turn it into a how question.
Okay.
No, I think that's a good question. That's great. Thank you for asking that, because I didn't. I think the why is actually, wow. I think the why part is, I think there's a spiritual component to that. I think the why has to do with sleeping well at night. It has to do with feeling like this life is meaningful, and that it wasn't wasted, and I think there's maybe an unjustifiable value component to that, because I don't know that any life is actually wasted. But I think part of the journey goes back to this idea of, and there is a kind of, I don't want to get into religious stuff.
Oh.
But I think there's a religious piece, which is there is kind of a central commandment that says that each of our jobs before we die, to some extent, is to do what we can to repair the world,
Mm-hmm.
and so part of the why is, how can I help to repair the world? And it's really, really difficult when you have that going on to inside of you, to say no to things. So that's my problem. I say yes to things, and that's the why, because I want to try to repair the world.
We're all trying to make the world a better place.
In our small ways, yes.
Mm-hmm. Being resilient. How can we set up systems of success for better partnerships and collaborative relationships to work with other organizations?
Well, it's interesting that's a great question too, because unfortunately, I think what happened in our field, in the field of ABA and autism, is that I think as a result of sort of economic and political realities, and it gets very, very complicated, we do a whole lot less collaborating than we used to. Collaboration used to be one of the fundamental aspects of our work. If you didn't collaborate, you were not doing a good job. It was really fundamental. But what's happened is because of the funding and supply and demand problems that we're having in our field right now, and the mandates that insurance companies or funding sources are placing on us for deeper and deeper utilization review, some of which is justified, some of which I think is really over the top. Because of these pressures on clinicians, because of the fact that, and to be really, really blunt, and I hate to be this blunt, but clinicians are not paid to collaborate anymore. If there are CPT codes, billing codes that exist that say if you call up an OT, you call up a physician, you call up someone else on the phone for 15 minutes, there are codes that in theory would allow you to bill for that time. No longer. The codes are still there, but third-party payers won't pay for that.
Mm.
So as a result of just the pressures on most clinicians, we don't collaborate enough, you know? And so the way I think we need to improve that is essentially the way we've done everything else, which is a lot of advocacy, a lot of insistence on how important collaboration is, and doing it anyway, and finding ways. You know, one of my mentors used to say that the way to not be depressed was to take more risks and get trickier.
Mhm.
And I think that given the pressures of time allocation and funding, it really demands taking more risks and getting trickier. So we do the right thing. We have to do the right thing as clinicians. And that means collaborate more. And as we collaborate, find ways to do it. Just find ways that are out of the box to do it. And I'll stop there because the more trickier we get, the more, you know, this is being recorded and we don't want the effect of those statements, but
Absolutely.
we get trickier.
Well, I know that ABA has come a long way from when it first started out. It's moved a lot from back in the old day to the way that it is today. People are constantly, asking questions about ABA, the ABA, from the past to now. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, it's been quite a journey. It's been quite a journey. Unfortunately, my editorial statement is that I don't think we've come far enough. I think we've got a long way to go. But yes, I think what's happening is that, the demand for our services has increased so much as a result of the funding landscape changing. That we have pressures on us that I alluded to before, to provide services in all sorts of ways that we didn't before. I think the biggest change over time, and I think this part I think is a good thing, although I don't think it's happened enough, is a movement within the ABA field, and it's always been there. It's just a matter of how much it catches on towards more naturalistic methods of teaching. ABA is fundamentally a teaching modality. I think that when ABA first began to be used with the autism population, that was back in the days of Ivar Lovaas at UCLA, that his methodology that he created with his team was very structured, highly structured, and somewhat rigid and not naturalistic. Excuse me. Lovaas himself didn't help with that problem. He was not the most articulate guy when it came to talking about his work and responding to critics. I think he missed the boat on a lot of things, but we all learned that the way to do our work was through what he ended up calling discrete trial training, DTT, what in the old days we used to call drill them and kill them. And unfortunately, the bad news is there's still a lot of that going on. I need to qualify this by saying that I also think that there are circumstances where discrete trial training in a very structured way is the right thing to do and the best thing to do for certain people. So I don't want to be entirely dismissive. There are situations when I think it's necessary. We can talk about some of the criticisms if we get to that point. But in any case, I think we're moving in the field through people like the Kegels, Bob and Len, who struggled really hard with creating pivotal response training, and then the NET people and natural environment people. These were people who intentionally or less intentionally created a much less structured kind of intervention that really, and I think this is a really fascinating point, especially for those people who oppose ABA as too rigid, or for whatever reasons they do. If you actually go on YouTube, for example, and you look at a session that's done by ABA's sort of arch nemesis, the RDI people, the relationship, the floor time people, or used to be called floor time people. If you look at a floor time session, watch it for 15 minutes or 20 minutes, and then look at an ABA session, maybe one that's a little oriented towards NET or natural environment interventions. It's really difficult to tell the difference between the two. They look very, very similar, and they're doing very, very similar things. The whole idea with DRI or RDI or whatever it's called is that you are, in quotes, following the child's lead, as opposed to following a structured curriculum. All that becomes, all those distinctions, when you get deeply into the work itself, tend to disappear. It ends up being essentially the same thing. But again, that has to do, again, with if you are choosing your target behaviors to work with in such a way that they're meaningful for the parent, meaningful for the child, and you're going to end up doing very much the same kinds of things. You're following the child's interest. You use a different language to describe what you're doing, but you're doing the same thing. So yeah, I think that's the biggest shift over time.
So maybe there needs to be a way that, some of these methodologies can be, like opened up in a lot of different ways, and, a lot of collaboration amongst the models possibly, so I don't know if that's ever a possibility.
Well, I think
out there.
I think if you know the history, and I'm old enough now to have lived through the history to a large extent, but if you know the history, you know that this attempt to sort of integrate has been going on from the very beginning, and it waxes and wanes. And And I think part of the problem, I mean, I think it's a big problem. I think it's one of the biggest problems there
Yeah.
is that many of the people, it's complicated. There's so many factors.
Right.
One factor is the fact that we're graduating people who are doing ABA with master's degrees. And there is an illusion by some people, this is a generalization, and I don't mean to stereotype, but I will say that I see this an awful lot in the field, that once you've got a 2-year degree, master's degree in ABA, or you've taken the coursework, and you sit for the exam, whether it's the QBA or the BCBA, and you pass the exam, that somehow now you're qualified to supervise. And I think there's a real deep misunderstanding in the field, including among those who are taking these exams and passing them.
Mm-hmm.
And that is to think, okay, now I've got the certification, now I'm qualified. And I would argue that that's hugely problematic. And that once upon a time, I asked a professor of mine, how long does it take to do a good intake assessment or appointment? And he said, about 30 years, before you do it well. And I think that we're dealing with hugely complicated processes. ABA, ABA is problematic because it's only one way of thinking about the world.
Right.
And what can we do in 2 years but teach the basic elements of the theory and the instruction manual? But unfortunately, the instruction manual is extremely inadequate for real life.
And it's like, how long does it take to become a good parent? You can't become a good parent in 1 year.
No.
It's a good 30 to 40 to a long.
Yeah. It's too late then, and then you get blamed for everything. Yeah.
That's very interesting. I know in my official Autism 101 manual, I described, I think it was 5 or 6 different methodologies, just because I wanted people to see the, flavor, what's out there. I think it's important for people to understand different perspectives. Okay, well, that was a great overview of what you were talking about. You've been in this field for over 30 years, having started one of the first ABA agencies in the country and growing it to one of the largest. I imagine you must have seen a lot in 30 years. Can you discuss some of the good and bad aspects of the field? I guess we talked a little bit about it.
Sure. No, that's great. Thank you. Well, it's always good to start with the good. The good is that I feel really blessed and really honored to meet the people who I've met in the field. I have to say that my colleagues, for the most part, there are very, very, very rare exceptions, but for the most part, my colleagues are they're wonderful people, loving people, kind people who are doing this work for the right reasons. And they truly, in their hearts, want to help others. And so in that sense, it's great to hang out with people in our field. And it's just a great group of people. Because I started an agency, because I've been an owner for many years, I get to meet a lot of other owners, especially pre-COVID. And by and large, they're just a great group of people who really want to do the right thing. And I think that they're highly motivated to help. They've got a lot of passion and a lot of energy. I envy that to some extent. So I think that's the good thing, and I think they're doing it for the right reasons. I think some of the things that trouble me, and I say this as a behavior analyst, and I say this as somebody who believes that, if I had a kid who needed our services, I would want a good behavior analyst to be doing those services. I'm a big believer in what we do. I have some really big concerns, though, about how we do it. And that's the bad side of it. That's some of the things that I've seen that sometimes I like to believe don't exist, but they do. Some of the horrendous things that happened years and years ago, it's important for people to know that the things that would make the news, the treating kids in really punitive and reversive ways, those were not things done by behavior analysts. That if you really look into each of those cases, they were usually done by people who didn't have credentials in the field, weren't psychologists, weren't behavior analysts, but people who were trying to make a buck and not really qualified. And so it's interesting if you look into that. However, I think as behavior analysts, we're still doing a lot of things that are really shooting ourselves in the foot. And it's not, it's innocent. I don't think there's anything evil behind it. It's just that there is a lot of hubris. I would say that my biggest concern is the amount of hubris that I encounter in the field. People who think, oh, you might call them dilettantes. I don't know. People who think that they know what they're doing. That's fine, but they do it without humility. And in doing it without humility, end up making a lot of mistakes. And part of that is because they're indoctrinated in a certain theory and a certain theoretical orientation. And I think there are a lot of historical reasons for that, but I think that creates a certain level of hubris. I think one of my favorite books, I think it's it's in my house, is my Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And one time I think it's a 2-volume set, maybe, yeah, it's a 2-volume set, really, really, really big book, and or books. And I looked up behaviorism in my Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And there's about 3 paragraphs on behaviorism. And the rest of it is all about other stuff. And it makes me think, what's that? You may know this better than me. That Shakespeare quote from Hamlet, that there's, what is it? There's more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy. It's that sort of thing where we tend to see the world through our glasses, our tinted glasses. And I think that creates a tremendous deficit for us, because it leads us to miss a whole lot of stuff. And so we focus so much, for example, on the child, if it's a child who we're working with, and their particular behavior problems. We're trained to do what's called functional analyses on that child's behavior. But we don't look at so-called ecological variables or antecedent variables, things like the family structure. We don't look at the socioeconomic things that plague families. We don't look at the cultural aspects of what we're doing. We don't look at trauma. We don't look at some of the things that really impact the work we do. And so when we're not successful, And again, part of this, the hubris, is that, you know, because we say ABA is evidence-based, and by the way, as an aside, we say, well, it's the only thing that's evidence-based. It's not the only thing that's evidence-based. And if you actually look at the evidence that we have, as impressive as it is, if you look at it from a researcher's point of view, it's never been impressive. And if you look at the research that we have, you know, and you add to that the confirmation bias, the publication bias, where we see that journals publish studies that have positive results and don't publish studies that don't. You know, really the best evidence that we have, you know, shows that we're kind of 50 to 70% effective, which is great. That's fabulous. If that's better than the rest, right? You want that. On the other hand, 30 to 50% of the time, we don't help people. And we need the humility to be able to look at that and understand what it is that we're not doing, that we need to be doing. And maybe it's creating a stable environment for the child. Maybe, you know, maybe it's working with the family. And that gets into this whole thing about, or looking at the physiological things. Because, well, that's not my domain. That's not within my scope of practice. Well, you know what? Doesn't work. That excuse doesn't work, right? If it's not in your scope, you need to learn enough about it to at least understand who to collaborate with, as you were talking about earlier. So you ought not to get away with that statement that it's not within my scope.
That's good. I like that. I like that thinking.
Yeah. So I think when it comes to the bad, I think most of the problems that we have in our field come out of this sense that we're the only way, you know, and it's almost a religious fervor, and that just creates a kind of narrow vision of what it is that we do, and it also, you know, look, you can get deeper and deeper into behavior analysis, and it, you know, there's that saying about PhDs, you know, being people who, oh, what is that? I love this saying. They learn more and more about less and less until they know everything there is to know about nothing, you know. And there is that problem. We can go deeper and deeper into our field. But as we do that, we're neglecting the rest of the world, the universe. And I think that part of our problem is that we think more and more narrowly, you know, and less broadly. So, you know, this is some of the things that plague our field. I think there's a lot of other things that plague our field too. But this is what I see that bothers me the most, I think, about what we're doing.
That's a very good answer. I love that last quote. Wow. What would you say are your three biggest concerns about the current state of the art?
Oh yeah, well, that was one of them. The hubris. Maybe the way to answer that is to talk a little bit about some other aspects of some of it stems from hubris. Some of it stems from just the culture. I think we have a cultural problem, as one way to look at it. At least I look at it that way. And that has to do with an immersion in a language and a theory that many people, sometimes correctly, because, you know, our language determines how we think often, and vice versa. It's immersed in the language of science. And I think that's hugely problematic. I think it's hugely problematic. I think that I think it's become almost more of a marketing strategy than it's become something meaningful. or that it is something meaningful. You know, there is, how do I say this? There's a sense that if we call it a science, somehow we're bestowing some legitimacy on the and one wonders why that's so important. If we are legitimate, why do we need to bend over backwards? Could be because we're being attacked from all sides, right? We've always been attacked from all sides, but I think the answer is to respond to those attacks in a way that's really understanding the substance of those attacks and acknowledging what's correct about them, you know. So just as an example of the problem, let's look for a moment at the language that we use. First of all, we call ourselves behavior analysts, right? Well, I'm not so sure that I want my child to be treated by an analyst. I may want, you know, my accounting to be done by a financial analyst, but I'm not sure that I want my child to be seen by someone who does analysis. Actually, most often they're treated by people, you know, there's 3 entry-level certifications or credentials, the RBT, the ABAT, and the BCAT. The T in all of those 3 initial groups of initials stands for technician. We call the people who are actually seeing our kids one-to-one technicians. I would love a technician to fix my dishwasher or my washer and dryer. But do I really want a technician to fix my child? You know, I don't think so. You know, so I think our language, which emanates from this idea back in the late 60s when ABA was being defined, it was defined by some actually wonderful people who I think would shudder at sort of where it's, you know, they're all dead now, but they would shudder at what it's become. And it's sort of well, you know, there was pride in this idea that we are technological, you know, scientific. And that was basically an attempt to translate the laboratory results that Skinner had working with pigeons primarily to humans. You know, Skinner did a much better job, but he struggled with a lot of things. You know, if you read some of Skinner's work, he struggled with the idea of positive reinforcement and what that even meant. And it was a very, you know, he was a great guy and a loving guy, but he ended up with a language that was problematic. We reinforce concrete. Do we really want to reinforce people? You know, and so what's wrong with saying praise or support or kindness? You know, you mentioned in the introduction that I did this movie, and it was about love, and it came from a research interest that I had. But in doing that movie, you know, if you ask parents what they want for their children, you know, what would they say? What did they say? You know,
they want them to be loved and cared for, and you know.
That's right. That's right. Amen. That's exactly what parents say, and that's what parents want. You know, we say love makes the world go round. You know, I think it kind of does. In researching that, you cannot find the word love, and believe me, I have tried. I've tried and tried. You cannot find the word love in any behavior analysis journal. Doesn't exist. Nobody studied it in behavior analysis. So how is it that the very thing that parents want for their child, we never even look at? We define it out of existence, you know? And I think this is a huge problem. And so we take this universe and we narrow it down to behaviors. Now, yes, one could argue that you need to be able to talk, and you need to be able to, access reinforcers, as we say, in order to end up in a loving relationship. I'm not so sure that's true, but that's okay. There's reasons for why behavior analysts think the way they do. But I think the point is still there, which is that, we are often really missing the boat on how we think about how we think about the world and how we talk about the world. I searched all of Skinner's writings as best as I could to see if he ever talked about love. He did in one paragraph. I found one of his books, and he equated it with positive reinforcement. Really? Is that it? Is that positive reinforcement? Is that love? Wow, we have a problem. So I think our language is problematic. And I think what happens with our language too, and as I mentioned, our language really controls our thinking and vice versa. So I think, what do I want to say about that?
It's time to change the language.
Well, yes, and I think we can do that. I used to do parent training programs, and as a behaviorist, proudly, I taught parenting from a behavioral perspective, and the curriculum I used was brilliant, and it was written in the 70s by two behaviorists at UCLA, and this is what I said, these aren't new thoughts. These are things that have been going on for a long time. And they put together a curriculum where they did exactly that. Instead of saying positive reinforcement, they just said praise, instead of saying punishment, and they called it mild, this is their term, mild social disapproval. We can use warm, loving English to get the same point across. If we see a kid who's tantruming, most behavior analysts will say, oh, we need to do an extinction protocol, right? What does a parent think when they hear the word extinction? Well, that's a word that brings up images of genocide, putting fires, right? But we say to people, try not to use jargon. They do it anyway. That's the language they speak. But it's also how we think. It's also how we think. So, like the parenting program called it, instead of extinction, they called it ignoring. That's really what it is. In plain English, just ignore it. And they got to leave even more technical, and they called it planned ignoring. We're going to plan for ignoring rather than we're going to, and we're going to create an extinction protocol. And don't worry, there's going to be an extinction burst. And, this is the language we use when we talk to parents. So again, some of that is just understanding who our clients are. And it's not that we don't love our clients. It's not that we don't care for them. We do. It's just that we don't quite know how to talk about it, So I think our language is really problematic. There's so many examples of that. There's, it goes on and on.
Oh, that's really important. Language is everything. Words are everything. They're very powerful.
Yes, exactly. And there's one other thing, and then I'll stop. And that has to do with a bad thing. And again, I think we're all victims of this, including the entire field of psychology. And I think what's happened to a large extent, and again, I think it's a result of political and economic forces, but it doesn't mean we have to allow ourselves to give into it, is that as a result, largely of wanting to get paid for what we do, we've fallen into the trap of functioning and thinking within a medical model.
Mm.
And I think that's highly problematic. ABA was not developed in a medical model. It was not designed to function in a medical model. And so much of its fundamental principles are in opposition to the medical model. Yet we've fallen hook, line, and sinker into that model.
Mm.
And it's creating a tremendous amount of problems. One of which is that in order to get services in this country anyway, one needs to have a diagnosis.
Mm-hmm.
And a diagnosis, by definition, means that there's something wrong and that you're sick. That's what it means, is that you're sick. There's pathology here.
Mm.
And so instantly we've got to create pathology where there probably, arguably, is none. But if you talk to a young behavior analyst who doesn't know any different, they're often going to say, oh, well, the kid's got autism. And that's why they're doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever I hear somebody say, someone's got autism and that's why they're doing that, my skin crawls. I actually get very, very upset because they don't really understand that that's not why the kid is doing that. The kid is doing that, and then they get the label of autism. It's the other way around. And it's very, very, very important because what happens with diagnosis is we create a sickness that doesn't exist. The reason that there was a neurodiversity movement, and you mentioned that also in your opening remarks, is because we screwed this up big time. Mm. And that's why there needs to be a neurodiversity movement. The neurodiversity movement is a reaction to labeling people as sick and having a disease. And what people who often don't understand, who are new to this field, is that the diagnosis is nothing more than a label. And I often use the analogy of, I mean, it's a silly one, and you can use any analogy, but I say, if you take a container, a bottle, and you fill it up with some white powder, and you close it up, now you've got a bottle with white powder. And then you make a label, and let's say you make a label and you call that and sugar, right? And you put the label on the bottle. Doesn't mean there's sugar inside the bottle, And I think what's happened is because now we give people a label, we think we know something about what's in the bottle. We know nothing about what's in the bottle by giving out a label. Committees have gotten together, and there's a long historical reason why we have diagnoses, but ultimately it's all about funding. Ultimately, it's all about how it is that we can get somebody to pay for the services that we need to help our child. So in California, which is often a bellwether state for a lot of regulations, what happened in California is that we had a whole mental health system that was really helpful. When I first started, we had mental health centers, community mental health centers. We had child programs. If a child was having difficulty in school or anywhere, a parent could bring their child to a clinic and get serviced, get seen by a social worker or a psychologist or marriage and family counselor. There were services available. We had something in the 70s called the taxpayer revolt in California. Those services were funded by property taxes, and property taxes were getting so high in California that there was a proposition called Proposition 13, and it came along. The voters basically did away with, they capped property taxes at 1%. Now it's up to 1.5%. It decimated the mental health system, clinics closed left and right, hospitals closed. We had nothing left. I'm exaggerating a bit, but we had essentially no services left. That system has never come back 50 years later. So we don't have ways to help children. And so through the lobbying efforts of some incredibly impressive, energetic, motivated parents and special ed lawyers, we were able to get mandates in place. And when those mandates came into place, they're, I'm simplifying in highly complex series of events, but one of those mandates was that if you had a child with autism, with that disease, that disorder, a DSM diagnosis of autism, well, therefore it was a health related problem and health insurance companies need to pay for it, or Medicaid needs to pay for it. Those laws were put in place. Now we have a mental health system again. But in order to qualify, you have to have a diagnosis, right? So all of a sudden, the diagnostic criteria become broader and broader. And any kid who's quirky and kind of has, difficulty with social situations, or it has repetitive, behavior, narrow interests, you can diagnose with autism and get them help, So, so we stick the label on the container. Doesn't mean we know anything about that child. So this is a huge problem because, again, it's another thing that people complain about, rightfully so, which is that my child, this person is not sick, they don't have a disease, they're neurodiverse.
Right.
But which is, but again, the problem with neurodiversity is that it shouldn't have to even be there. We should, because if you say someone's neurodiverse, you're implying that someone else is neurotypical. Someone else isn't, right? And the whole point is that nobody's typical.
Right.
Right?
Yes.
It's kind of a necessary evil to have a neurodiverse movement. We shouldn't need to have it, but we do. So people can understand that it isn't all about sickness.
That's right. It's just embracing differences.
Exactly.
Supporting people in their challenges and helping, offer tools and resources so that they can work through the things, focus on what can help them in their challenges.
Yes. And ABA is fundamentally not judgmental. We don't look at diagnoses. That's just the ticket into the system.
Right.
However, it's so prevalent in our culture. And by the way, I do a lot of assessment, and parents come to me thinking, oh my God, my kid's got autism, as if that is something real, And so the culture, the system that we're in is even indoctrinating parents to think, oh my God, there's something wrong with my child. And, what we have to say is, and by the way, there are situations in which we do have the old traditional, what we used to see 30 plus years ago. We still have that small percentage of kids who can't speak, bang their heads up against the wall, rock all day long. They're still just a very small percentage of the kids we see. But in those situations, yes, we can say there's something developmentally going on here. We don't know what it is. Nobody knows what it is, unless we do, which is very, very, very small percentage of kids. We could say, oh, that's Fragile X, or, that's, that's a specific neurological or disorder. But you know, but that's a small percentage. So yeah, ABA is not designed to treat diagnoses. However, we're parents, therapists, clinicians all think, you know, there's something wrong that we need to fix. All is an exaggeration, obviously. But, you know, this is a problem that we face. And it becomes a marketing problem for us in the field because people start believing that this is true, as opposed to, you know, let's truly see people as individuals and let's truly understand them. And it's who they are that matters.
That's true. Yeah.
And not the label that we put on them.
That's true. That's true. We're actually trying to change the perception of autism by focusing on the star rather than the puzzle, because the puzzle, the whole brand, the puzzle is just, you know, we're not trying to fix people. We're trying to focus on their gifts, strengths, and talents. So
yes,
we have a star as our brand and always has been.
No, that's great. I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. Yeah. And, you know, there's been a movement again from almost the beginning called positive behavior supports. There's a whole section of our field that's devoted itself to exactly what you're saying. Let's focus on strength. Let's focus on the positives, and let's use those strengths to really help improve the lives of the people we work with, not because they have a disorder, but because that's what.
Yes, and follow their lead of what they like to do, you know, like the music, art, theater, things like that.
Yeah,
really
exactly.
exciting stuff. Great. Well, that was really, really interesting. And I learned so much from you. And did you read all those books on the back of your
No,
shelf?
I say to people, I don't read books, I use them. Yeah. Yeah.
Did you have anything else that you want to share with us?
I don't know. What's our time like? You know, I think, how are we doing on time?
I think we're doing good. I have one more question. If you had your
Sure.
way, what would you change about how services are delivered or how behavior analysts are trained?
Oh boy. Well, you know, I think there needs to be, in terms of the training, I'm not sure. Boy, this is a terribly judgmental thing to say, and I worry about saying this. I'm not sure who's training our master's level clinicians, but it seems like they're coming out of school with some deep misunderstandings about what we do and our history. And I think, to a large extent, I think there needs to be, as I said, sort of less hubris, a deep understanding that our way of thinking is one way of thinking, and that there's deep value to learning how the world is seen by others in our field, as opposed to a culture of argumentativeness and dismissal of alternative ways of thinking, or the hubris associated with ours is the only evidence-based approach, which is just factually not true. I think that as we said, in some ways, this is kind of a summary, right? I think as we talked about, there needs to be a bigger emphasis on the common factors that are healing, rather than to say, for example, that we understand that we get from point A to point B because of our theory, you know, and really believe that that's how to get from point A to point B. Maybe that's all we know. But what training is not teaching us often is that there really isn't any deep support for the fact that that's really what we might call the active ingredient for change. So if you look at the literature, the research literature on, if you look at the research literature on what we know different, let me back up for 1 second. There's some great research from a long time ago that if you take 3 clinicians, you take a behaviorist, a cognitive psychologist, a humanistic person, a Gestalt therapist, a psychoanalyst, you put them behind a one-way mirror and you have them watch a therapy session. By and large, they're all going to agree on whether that was a good session or a lousy session.
Mm-hmm.
But when you ask them to explain why,
Yeah.
they're going to all give you their answers in a different language.
Mm.
So what we've done is we've created a Tower of Babel in our field. And so what I would like to see happen is for people to understand that we know what helps people. It isn't necessarily that a child learns to talk or learns to recognize an object and label it, or learns not to tantrum, or learns how to comply with requests because we've positively reinforced that child. That's not necessarily how they're learning. It's how we think they're learning, but it's not necessarily how they're learning. So the research on common factors say that people change not as a result of a particular theory. They change as a result of having a relationship with another person that's safe and creates a safe environment, that's trusting. There's actually, I actually have a list. There's 11 things that the research has talked about that crosses therapeutic alliance, empathy, hope and expectancy, feedback, cultural competence, safe environment, learning by doing, yes, exposure to corrective experiences. These are the kinds of things that the research says all therapies have in common, the ones that work. And it's more likely that our children are, whether it's our children or adults, they're doing better and they're learning based on these core principles, not on our theory, So we need to emphasize this, because when we emphasize it and people really understand that, they'll have less conceit and about what they're doing, and they'll be more open-minded to other approaches. And I think, so that's how I'd like to see the world change.
That's great. Thank you so much, Ira. You have been a wealth of information, and we really appreciate having you. Thank you so much.
It's been fun. Thank you.
Been a pleasure having you.